one of the recommendations that the GMAC made to Commissioner Pham, Acting Chair Pham, was that if an asset is otherwise collateral eligible, then wrapping that in the token should not change its collateral eligibility status. Maybe you want a different haircut on it, but the underlying asset is still the same asset. That sounds like a really nuanced, esoteric thing. But those are some of the questions that you're answering. Yeah. One of my favorites is, how to consider Reg-NMS in a world where there's tokenized equities. If you're not familiar with it, one of the parts of Reg-NMS is this concept of the order protection rule, which basically states you need to ensure that the best price is traded against. And so if I go to try to buy ones on an exchange over here and I could buy it for 3/4 over on another exchange, you kind of got to route away. But what happens if I'm trying to buy an asset on a traditional equities exchange and I'm being told I need to route away to a tokenized equities exchange? And that tokenized equities exchange is a pre-funded model. Mm-hmm. And it's me as the participant pre-funding my account. Does that even work? What happens if I'm not pre-funded to a sufficient amount? And how do you think about the implications of that? And so there's some really, I'm going to call it fascinating. I recognize that not everyone will call it fascinating, but I think fascinating questions that need to be asked about how you go about solving for these things.
Hello and welcome to another episode of RuleMatch Spot On, the only podcast focused exclusively on the institutional crypto and digital asset industry. I'm your host, Ian Simpson, and if you want to know what banks, securities firms, active trading firms, hedge funds, and others are doing in crypto and digital assets and how they're doing it, this is the place for you. So we're back with the second half of our interview with Chris Zuehlke, partner at DRW and global head of Cumberland. Let's dive in. We'll get to the stablecoins. We'll get to collateral in a minute. But back to your role in trading as a firm. You both do the OTC and you trade on exchange, so to say. We talked about this earlier before the conversation about kind of how the market shifts and what is the balance of that. Talk to us just a little bit about how you see the market maturing and whether it's more OTC, more on exchange, or maybe something else.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the pieces that you missed in the more OTC and more on exchange is kind of DeFi native transactions, but we could put that aside for now. We actually get this question quite a bit. It's as lit markets, as exchanges get more liquid, is there a role for OTC? And my reaction has always been, well, go and look at these already developed markets, whether or not it's, FX or, rates or anything else. There are certain transactions that are more effectively done in an OTC or bilateral way. I mean, even on the, central limit order book exchanges, they have things like block trades. And the idea is that this trade is of a size that perhaps would be more effectively managed and transacted in a bilaterally negotiated transaction rather than on CLOB. Because, listen, if you need to get a large clip done, can the central limit order book actually support that amount of liquidity? I think the premise is that maybe it can't. And so at the end of the day, regardless of how mature this market becomes, we've seen time and time again across many different markets that OTC, side by side with on exchange, is a critical hybrid solution that I absolutely think will continue to be the case here. Mm-hmm. And it might actually grow on the OTC side. I think people say, okay, well, maybe it'll taper off a little bit. But when you start to talk about institutions coming in to trade these products, typically institutions will trade for a larger size than retail. Sometimes those institutions will also want some of the privacy that is afforded to them in a bilateral transaction rather than seeing those transactions flow to the screen. And more, I think that will be the case. And so I think there's an argument that the OTC business will continue to thrive over the course of the next however many years as more participants enter into the space, as the transactions become more complex, as the size becomes larger, and as privacy around some of these transactions becomes more and more important.
Mm-hmm. And just when we talk about the change in market and that proportion, so to speak, do you think regulation for larger financial institutions will have any effect on that, or?
Oh yeah, I mean that might be the easiest question I'll get all day.
Well,
yeah.
But I mean on the proportion of OTC versus
okay.
Yeah.
I think it will. It's hard to say how market participants, those that are active now and those that are looking to become active in the future, will react to regulation until it is formalized, until it's codified in statute, and until there's a wide-reaching adoption of trading within those regions, right? So what do we have? We have at least some of the more notable ones in my mind. You have Singapore with their various different licenses. You have Europe with MiCA. And in the United States, this is kind of the big headline right now, is the movement of stablecoin bills through Congress and the market structure bill working its way through Congress. And I think all of those are at times a necessary condition for some of these larger organizations to participate, the ones that have been on the sideline in particular. And once they're able to participate, I think they will naturally bring a similar scale business to crypto as they have in other asset classes. And so I think it's very, very natural for them to, as they enter the space, look at how they conduct, say, FX businesses or any other business for that matter, and try to emulate similar workflows. Mm-hmm. And they will look to the OTC market in ways similar to the way they use OTC markets in other asset classes. And they will look to CLOBs in similar ways that they look into other asset classes. And over time, there'll be some ebb and flow of demand in each one of those. But I think it's one of those rising tides raises all ships kind of dynamic. And I think it will benefit both the on-exchange and the, I'll call it off-exchange or bilateral businesses.
Mm-hmm. So those new institutions coming in will be looking to replicate more and more of what they know from other markets. Will they also be looking to maybe a thought leader like Cumberland to guide them through the new possibilities in capital markets when it comes to tokenization? I know that you've spoken different times about how, looking to make capital markets fully digital, put it on digital rails. You've been experimenting with these things internally. Where is that process kind of right now? And are you maybe in a position already to say, come on, guys, come follow us, let's do it this way?
It's actually my favorite part of the job. I can't help myself. I'm a bit of a market structure geek. And I think one of the more fascinating developments over the course of the past 18 months is the way traditional capital markets and DeFi markets are starting to kind of co-evolve. I don't know how else to describe it. When I first got involved in market structure, one of the first rules that I heard was first do no harm. You can't break things. It's too important to break. And I understand that. I respect that. It makes a whole lot of sense to me. But then when you think about the real world implications, I think it raises an important question. I'll give you an example. There's this thing called Reg-AT, which was something introduced by the CFTC to build some rules around automated trading. The AT is automated trading. And the only reason I know this is because it was tied to major life events for me. Mm-hmm. And my wife knows this, so I don't think I'll get in trouble for admitting this. When Reg-AT started its life, it started as this thing called a concept release, which is the commission coming out and saying, we have a lot of questions on this. We would like the industry to help us understand that. That's a great step, right? That's what you hope out of your regulators. And I remember responding to that on my honeymoon. This was...
Okay, here it comes.
Yeah. And so, we respond to that. We engage in that dialogue, the back and forth. And, it continues to progress forward. And eventually there's a proposed rule. And I remember responding to that proposed rule via a comment letter while at the maternity ward when my son was born.
Wow.
I had some downtime to, and
you were working hard too.
I was very relaxed in the grand scheme of things compared to other things.
Yeah.
And then finally, in 2020, there was guidance by the CFTC that they were going to unwind Reg AT and instead go to a principles-based solution, which was a little bit after my daughter was born. And so it's been the better part of a decade to go from those initial conversations to that final guidance. And in that time, automated trading, electronic trading became ubiquitous. I remember going from the period of time where there was a debate about whether or not this was something banks would ever do to now it's just baked into their execution algorithms. And so you look at that and you say, well, it's great that the commission was very thoughtful and engaged with the industry, but it took almost a decade. I think, to be fair, maybe more like 7 years. And I don't know if that is the right timeline for these sorts of things, particularly when the adoption is happening nonetheless. And so we look a lot at DeFi now through kind of a similar lens. And I think one of the most fascinating parts about DeFi is it creates a sandbox, right? A sandbox that just has not existed for innovation in capital markets historically. And some things will work and some things won't. But what TradFi gets to do is to cherry pick those good ideas once they're battle hardened, once they're proven out, and to adopt them. And so what's happening now is, historically it was DeFi kind of cherry picking ideas from TradFi and then building new ideas, building new protocols. More recently, you're seeing those capital markets institutions cherry picking these ideas like the ability to tokenize an asset for 24/7 mobility, the ability to use tokenized dollars for real-time settlements, and bringing that to the capital markets as a way to address some of these resiliency problems. And so in a way, I think, there's been a lot happening both in TradFi and DeFi to innovate, but more and more, it's now kind of a two-way street. And I think that's a really fascinating development because where we once had a lot of difficulty identifying merit-based innovations, there is now a place for that. And I think what the U.S. with this new administration is doing to kind of codify that ability to innovate, to try to empower individuals to find ways to bring kind of solutions to bear to the market in kind of a sound and kind of thoughtful regulatory framework is a really important step to kind of continue to grow that, almost like that bilateral innovation work flow. Yeah.
So there is, of course, that innovation use cases I think you were talking about earlier that are really more concrete these days from institutions who have learned, cherry-picked a bit the ideas, now putting them into projects. Meanwhile, the market continues to grow. If we talk about tokenization just in general, I think it was 24 billion or something in kind of on-chain assets, 7 billion in US T-bills, 800 million in tokenized gold. There's a market growing. It's not huge, but it's growing. What do you think is kind of the state of play in this market from the perspective of a trading firm?
For tokenization?
And tokenization.
So I think it's the core principle here, and I think this is an important step. The core principle seems to have evolved into use case-based innovation. If you look back in 18, 19, 20, a lot of it was the conceptual innovation. Wouldn't it be great if we could? And sometimes that bore out as a really important kind of advancement in technology or capabilities. And sometimes it kind of turns into a solution in search of a problem. More recently, really say in the past 18 months or so, the narrative has shifted to, I have a use case. How can I use blockchain technology to improve on that use case? And I think that was an important step because we're no longer talking in the abstract. We're talking about specific usable solutions that there is a market demand for. And so when I think about some of the more important steps that we're taking as an industry, two things really jump out at me. One, which I mentioned earlier, was collateral mobility, 24/7. I think the reason why that is important is probably pretty transparent, but at the end of the day, one of the biggest pieces of uncertainty in the marketplace is especially over the weekends or overnight, will this counterparty make the margin call? Will the collateral be there that I need? And I mean, like, if we were just going to be objective, and one of the things that we always talk about is, well, if you were to start over from scratch, how would you rebuild it? I think knowing what the world knows now and the fact that it's a global 24/7 economy, nobody would say, all right, let's have the markets close for 48 hours on the weekends and make it so you can't manage risk. I think everyone would say, well, of course it should be 24/7. And so, I've gotten into this debate before where, I'd argued that tokenization of collateral is an incredibly important innovation, and that the amount of uncertainty and the amount of risk that it would take out of the system to have is, arguably one of the biggest steps forward in risk management that we've seen in recent times. And the response, sometimes is, well, people don't work 24/7. And, nobody works 24/7, right? But I think to ignore the fact that when there are big market dislocations on the weekend and people are looking to manage the risk during that, and they don't have the tools to do so, to ignore that issue is a bit naive, right? I've made the comment where, do you think the CROs and the head traders and the CEOs put their phone down on the weekend and go watch a football match when the markets are dislocated? Well, no, they're kind of glued to their screens waiting for that open on Monday to make sure that their counterparties can make their margin calls or that the collateral is there where they need it to be. And the only issue is they don't have the tool to do so today. And so I think if you offer them the tool to do so, not only will that dramatically decrease just dislocation risk in general, whether or not some of the examples I mentioned earlier, but you probably also make the market much more efficient in avoiding those dislocations to begin with, right? Because you kind of release the pressure valve incrementally over the weekend. You don't just wait for it to get into the red and then just make that margin call. You make incremental ones. But two, the cost of collateral, the haircuts on the collateral will improve. And so it actually probably becomes more economically positive for the participants in those transactions. And so I think that move towards 24/7 collateral, tokenization of the assets for that purpose will be a big forcing function because there is a demand today.
And is that, do you feel that is the reason that you have this amount of tokenized T-bills and the money market funds? Is this the use case that the people who are tokenizing these things are thinking about at this point? Or
yeah, I think that's one of them. I think the other one is repo. The reality is the repo market is arguably one of the most foundational pieces of market activity there is, right? Just the concept of being able to finance efficiently is incredibly important. And so, if I have a tokenized, collateral eligible asset, tokenized, treasury, and I'm able to post that and to take delivery on, say, a tokenized dollar in real time over the weekend, the effect of that on my capital efficiency is profound, right? Let's construct an example. Let's say, just for sake of argument, I need to borrow $100 million for my weekend trading. Well, the second I borrow that money, I'm paying carry on it. If I only deploy half of that at any given point in time, I am paying carry on $50 million worth of borrow that I'm doing nothing with. I'm also probably reducing optionality for those dollars elsewhere within the organization. And so the ability to instead say, let's tokenize those treasuries, let's have them available for when we need to repo them out. And then once we have the market opportunity to use them, we repo them out, we take the tokenized dollar, we deploy the dollars, and once we're done, we're unwinding it all. You bring your, I'll say, cost to carry down to the efficient frontier. And that sounds great from just a pure dollars and cents perspective. And you could run the math to figure out how much you would save. But it also lowers kind of the capital hurdle for some of your trades because your effective carry on your dollar goes down. And so I think that as well is another major forcing function for utility of tokenized assets. And I think that's what's important. What is the utility? It's no different than stablecoins, right? Why are stablecoins so interesting to people? They have a profound utility. I'm able to move dollars in real time to where they need to be. And I think that's just a big leap forward from the way the banking industry works today.
And in those use cases, the collateral mobility, who will be the players or who are the players really pushing for that, making that happen, and making that happen at scale? Is it people like Cumberland? Is it the BlackRocks? Is it a concert of people working together that are really going to make that happen?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of everyone that's part of that workflow in general, and so that means the anywhere from the issuers to the custody providers to the CSDs and the transfer agents and all of them. It requires them all to get it right. But I think historically there's been a kind of a missing element, right? When we start to think about these large transactions, whether or not it's moving collateral for derivatives trading to an exchange or to a counterparty, or if it's repo, one of the things that an organization like ours is very sensitive to is the visibility of that. And do we really want the world to know when we're moving collateral to an exchange such that someone that has enough time on their hands and enough knowledge about it could back out our positions? Right? I think that's a big risk, and I think potentially one of the biggest headwinds for this. Now, we work with and build solutions onto a blockchain called Canton. It's a public L1, and they have configurable privacy available. And so the ability to leverage the configurable privacy of Canton to facilitate the movement of collateral is something that we think is an important step that needed to be taken, and I think will enable a lot of these workflows ultimately.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to that regulation question, which can never be escaped. The bills that are moving around in Congress in the U.S., just talk to me a little bit about how you see those and the potential effect of those. Is there one perhaps that's more important than the other, the stablecoin or the market infrastructure, or how do you feel about that?
It's
like suddenly difficult.
Yeah. It's like asking me which of my kids is my favorite. They're both great.
Sure.
Love them dearly.
Or which would accelerate things more?
So I think they solve for different problems. Is the reality. I think the stablecoin bill is critically important because of what it represents for an innovation that would enable a fundamental change in how value moves amongst organizations. And, I think the bill is reasonably well structured. But in order to have the clarity around how a stablecoin is treated and, the constructs that it must kind of, have, I think will go a long way to getting organizations comfortable to accept it for things like collateral and for, transaction purposes, for payment purposes even. We saw just recently that I think it was Coinbase and Nodal announced that they were going to start to accept USDC as collateral. These are important shifts, and I think the more that there's clarity from a regulatory perspective about how it's treated on balance sheet and how it's constructed, and how you need to report on certain things, goes a long way to enabling what is arguably the first material shift in how people are able to manage value movement through the network, ultimately, the network of financial markets, right? The market structure bill, I think, goes a long way to providing clarity around items that historically have not been clear and have been subject to debate. And so oftentimes where there's lack of clarity, organizations will kind of put their hands up and say, we're not going to do anything until there's clarity. And so I think one represents, in the stablecoin bill, represents a very clear, demonstrable use case that people are hungry for and will enable. And the other represents the introduction of structure and clarity where previously there wasn't. And so we'll answer a number of questions for organizations that needed some answering. And on any given organization, depending on what your business use case is, some amount of that market structure bill might be critical to how you think about your future. So it's really hard to say which one's more important. I've seen people argue that maybe you should do one first and then the other. Some people argue that maybe you should go side by side. I do think that there's merit in doing one and then the other, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Would there be one that it would have more of an effect for Cumberland in particular, or?
I haven't really thought thought too much about that because they're both kind of just foundationally important things for the crypto asset market in general. I do believe that a lot of the use cases that we would like to see grow can, I think, be adopted quicker once either one of those is live. And so it's really hard for me to say A is more important than B is more important. It's kind of depends on what our specific business is. But I think that really speaks to the overarching importance of getting these done because it's not just one thing that answers the questions for an organization. Maybe you're a very kind of narrowly scoped organization, right? It does. But when you have a wide-reaching business, it's kind of a little bit of everything is what you'd like to see.
Sure. There is some part of the bills that talk about the SEC and the CFTC working more closely together. I think some people have some suspicions that might not be so easy. You have any feelings or thoughts about that? Or
I could see why it wouldn't be easy, right? You have two different agencies with their own mandates and their own agendas and their own leadership. And in that construct, if you're both trying to build a solution for a specific aspect of the market, it will take a lot of coordination to get it done correctly. And I think to build the muscle memory on how to coordinate it's a difficult thing, right? It's not impossible. And I think if they both had a similar perspective on kind of like being outcome driven, what is the outcome we're trying to get to, and are coming at it from a good faith perspective, it is possible. But listen, it's not just CFTC and SEC working with each other. It's, think about your organization or my organization. Let's say we wanted to collaborate on something. It takes a lot of work to collaborate. And if you're ever in a situation where, one is ready to move and the other one's not, that creates a very kind of like, almost like chilling effect on the progress that you can make. Yeah. And so while I do think it is possible for two organizations to work together, it's one of those things where you say, well, is it more effective if just one organization can run with this and then give them the authority to do so? And anytime there's any sort of ambiguity about whose ultimate responsibility it is, it's a friction point, right? And so like you need to remove any ambiguity whatsoever. And that's hard to do. That's hard to do, especially as markets continue to evolve. So, the reality is we have two different regulators in the United States and they each have their mandates. Hopefully we come up with a way that makes it very clear whose responsibility is what.
Some other people in the market have given feedback to some of the rules and some of the things in place or coming up. Securitize gave some feedback around market guidance from the SEC around the three-step process and digital assets, tokenized securities as non-bearer instruments. Do you engage also with some of that, and do you agree, not agree, or how do you think about some of those topics? Yeah,
so we've been lucky enough to be invited to participate in a number of kind of the open market structure conversations. The CFTC has something called the Global Markets Advisory Committee that I had the privilege of participating in. The SEC has been holding the crypto task force roundtables, and we had the privilege of being able to participate in that. So we absolutely engage. And I think at our core, we believe that it's partially our responsibility to lend at least our experience, and I would argue our expertise, but lend it to those conversations. Now, there are dozens of these types of conversations happening, right? And it's all in kind of very nuanced and niche type things. And it can kind of go down to really, really deep details, right? One of the recommendations that the GMAC made to Commissioner Pham, Acting Chair Pham, was that if an asset is otherwise collateral eligible, then wrapping that in a token should not change its collateral eligibility status. Maybe you want a different haircut on it, but the underlying asset is still the same asset. That sounds like a really nuanced, esoteric thing, but those are some of the questions that you're answering. Yeah. One of my favorites is, how to consider Reg-NMS in a world where there's tokenized equities. if you're not familiar with it, one of the parts of Reg-NMS is this concept of order protection rule, which basically states you need to ensure that the best price is traded against. And so if I go to try to buy ones on an exchange over here and I could buy it for 3/4 over on another exchange, you kind of got to route away. But what happens if I'm trying to buy an asset on a traditional equities exchange and I'm being told I need to route away to a tokenized equities exchange? And that tokenized equities exchange is a pre-funded model. And it's me as the participant pre-funding my account. Does that even work? What happens if I'm not pre-funded to a sufficient amount? And how do you think about the implications of that? And so there's some really, I'm going to call it fascinating. I recognize that not everyone will call it fascinating, but I think fascinating questions that need to be asked about how you go about solving for these things. And when you try to apply a rule or a law that was written before the technology even existed to contemplate, how difficult is it to overlay those rules on this new technology? It's very difficult in most circumstances. And I think that's probably some of what Securitize is pointing to. So sometimes you need to look at it and you say, okay, again, if you were to do it from scratch, how exactly would you do this? And on my example, I don't know, there's a lot of debate to be had, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the first question that's answered. I think you can work your way towards those answers as the market continues to develop.
Mm-hmm. And regulation obviously matters. Do you have any feelings about how regulation in the US versus regulation in Europe versus regulation in other places will potentially change the market? When we think about crypto as a global market, and in one sense, you've had global price discovery, you've had different things happening around the world. How potentially does that change the dynamics going forward?
Anyone's guess. I mean, really, it's hard to say. Yeah. I think there's many different jurisdictions that are advancing crypto regulations in a thoughtful and sound way, and I think it's great to see. They each optimize for slightly different things, but that's natural. What I think will be the most interesting question to ask is about harmonization going forward. That's always been a difficult problem, and it's not just crypto, right? I remember, I spent some time, thinking about swaps rules and laws when they came through, and harmonization across, countries and continents was an important question there as well. And so, I really do think that it's great to see this progress. It certainly raises the barrier of entry a little bit, because it takes a lot of work to get licensed and comply with those licenses. But I think those organizations that are looking to, grow in a thoughtful and compliant manner kind of welcome that. And for me, it's really a question less of how do we comply within a single jurisdiction, and more how do you build a global organization that complies with each one of those jurisdictional requirements. You don't even need to look too far. The current market structure bill in the United States has federal preemption for anything that has kind of a federal regulatory category. I'm probably oversimplifying it, but what that basically means is the federal law preempts any state level law. But if you aren't regulated by the federal government, whatever regulator it is, well, then you could be subject to state level regulations. And so it's entirely possible that in the extreme, an organization that is not part of a regulated category at, say, the CFTC or SEC now needs to be regulated by 50 different states. Mm-hmm. And, that's probably not, cool. Not an efficient outcome. Now, I recognize the need for, safety and soundness of the markets, but there seems like there could be a more efficient way to handle this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of true globally. It's just much more difficult to solve for as you start to transcend country boundaries. Yeah. And so we'll see how that plays out over time. But I think that's something I'm watching pretty closely.
We talk about stablecoins, and maybe I give an answer to the question I asked earlier. I think maybe the stablecoin bill would potentially be as important as anything for Cumberland. Just when I think back to what Eric Saraniecki from Canton was saying on the podcast back in January, I think it was. We were sitting out in minus 14-degree weather in St. Moritz, and he made the statement, very true, I don't think we really appreciate how amazing a thing a stablecoin is, actually. Just talk to me a little bit about how much you would integrate a stablecoin into the things that Cumberland does and how far you are with that.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a fair point. I think that is a very accurate statement. I don't think people truly appreciate how powerful of an innovation a stablecoin is. But maybe for some context, right? We participated in the Silvergate and the Signature banking networks when they were around. And as a result, we had the ability to settle with counterparties, with exchanges, and a number of other different participants in a 24/7 real-time basis. Now, you still had to wire dollars into that network and wire them out, so it wasn't totally frictionless. But once you were in that network, you were able to move assets with relative effectiveness and efficiency. And that changed how we thought about risk management, right? That's kind of the premise. The faster you can move value, the quicker you could settle, you fundamentally shift your perspective on risk management. And nearly overnight, that was taken away. And luckily, we had built all the infrastructure and the risk management policies and procedures that would allow us to operate effectively and efficiently in I'll call it a non-Silvergate and Signature world. And so we shifted, right? But in one of those you don't know what you got until it's gone sort of situations, you all of a sudden you look at this and say, that was an incredibly powerful way to handle value movement and settlement. And so, what do stablecoins do? Well, stablecoins are fairly similar to exactly that, except, and I think more importantly, have the ability to be boundaryless in a way that those kind of settlement networks weren't, right? If I could take a stablecoin and settle with a counterparty, and then some other counterparty settles with me with stablecoins, and then I can move those stables to an exchange, or I could use them to post collateral at a DCM, like that flexibility, the ability to move value that quickly, unencumbered by banking hours, is an incredibly powerful thing. And the amount of uncertainty it takes out of the system is significant. And so I think we're just at the early stages of really understanding the amount of utility that could exist in a stablecoin within the capital markets in general. We've only seen a fraction, right? We've only seen kind of the crypto native fraction of that. But I think once the stablecoin bill gets passed, it really does unlock a lot of utility, whether or not it's for collateral or it's for banking purposes or for balance sheet management or anything else for that matter. So, I'm going to still say they're all important, but maybe I'll give some points to the stablecoin side of things.
And just on the back of that, there's a little bit of a debate shaping up between those in the camp of fully backed stablecoins versus the potential for tokenized deposits, maybe from banks, fractionalized, not fully backed. How do you think that might play out? Can both coexist or not? Or
so I think both could coexist, but I do think that there's, maybe I'm biased, but I think there is a lot more strength in the solution of a fully backed stablecoin. The topical ones are obvious, right? Like if you have a chain agnostic, kind of platform agnostic stablecoin that is kind of freely transferable, that has an immense amount of utility. If you're in any kind of walled garden, that utility is, I'll call it fractionalized. Now, sticking with that term, I think the deeper element is one of the reasons why stablecoins, I think, could be very interesting is it moves you away from fractionalized banking. It can move you away from the counterparty risk that exists there. And at a certain point in time, I think once a stablecoin issuer in the United States is regulated by the federal government, it's a pretty quick step to go and get access to the standard repo facility. And could they then go and deposit dollars with the Fed? You could construct, and I don't think you're that far away from constructing a stablecoin that is fully backed, that does not have the risk of fractionalized banking. Tokenized bank deposits, depends on how they construct them, obviously, but I think if you were to inherit that, you're losing some of the value that exists behind like a well-constructed stablecoin.
We'll have to wait and see, obviously, as all those things play out. Before we kind of move towards the end, we've seen in the institutional space, but also in the market infrastructure space, some M&A. Coinbase buying Deribit, Ripple buys Hidden Road, different companies coming together, some consolidation. Do you think that's good for the space, or what does that bring to the space?
I think a reasonable amount of consolidation is a good thing, right? I think it's important to have a diversified set of solutions and competition, right? Competition always breeds the best for the end users, in my opinion. And now seems like a very natural time for there to be some amount of M&A activity. You have a series of organizations that historically have had a narrowly scoped opportunity set, now starting to have the doors kind of opened wide because of regulation in Europe and Asia and in the United States. And so you have these organizations that either could not or were focused elsewhere, to solve some of those problems. And they now have the ability to go and find those companies, those projects that were well designed and kind of maybe niche, but solved a problem well, and bring them under their wing. And so that will allow for, I think, a more rapid evolution and innovation in the space, as opposed to, say, company A going and building their own competitor to company B. Now, ultimately, I do think there's so much as too much consolidation, and so I'm watching it pretty closely. But I think this is a good thing for the market right now. I think it could help certain companies advance their efforts in a way that they couldn't without M&A. And hopefully at the end of the day, what ends up happening is those organizations that are best positioned to grow to a larger scale find those best designed solutions, bring them in-house, and then they use that distribution to kind of scale them out and make them more available to people. Mm-hmm. And so I think we'll see what the end state is, but I think it is very much a reasonable time for this M&A cycle. And I think when we come out the other end of it, it will be the market structure will be a bit stronger than it was when it all started.
Okay. I won't ask if Cumberland is shopping these days.
Thank you.
Maybe just
well, we do have some VC businesses,
yeah.
But obviously we can't get into the details on that.
Sure. Just to wrap things up, we sometimes ask people to look into the crystal ball looking forward, but I thought it would be more interesting with somebody of your experience to take a look backwards. Has there been something that you expected to see in the market or thought would happen faster in the market that hasn't really played out, and maybe why you think that's happened?
Yeah, it's real nice of you to ask me when I've been wrong. So
we all try to stay humble.
Yeah, no.
Right?
Listen. I've been wrong. You mentioned the ETF thing. I've been wrong a few times. I really thought we would see a more vibrant tokenized FX market than we see today. It's one of those marketplaces that seems ripe to transition to a tokenized space. You already have a very vibrant stablecoin market. You've kind of solved certain elements of the problem about how you mint and redeem and go from fiat into tokens. Clearly, the settlement process on the tokenized side of things is better than just settlement to fiat. And so it seems like all the building blocks are there. I mean, we spent a lot of time thinking about it, and the reality is that last mile, that on-ramp, off-ramp, I guess maybe the first mile, last mile, there's a lot of complexity in that, and there's a lot of jurisdictional complexity in all that too. And so I can understand why we haven't gotten there, but I think we started with me saying we really thought there's a lot of similarities between the FX market and the crypto market. It seemed like one of those natural evolutions that would have taken place quicker. Now that said, I think it's not a kind of a cast-off, right? It's not as if people said we can't do this. I think people are actively working on trying to solve that problem, and so I do still think that it will happen in due course, and probably faster than my now slightly informed by history, pessimistic view might be. But it seems like one of those problems that'll get solved sooner rather than later. So
we'll wait and see.
Yeah, we'll wait and see.
Chris Zuehlke, thank you very much for joining RULEMATCH Spot On. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I had a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on.
Look forward to another time perhaps in the future.
Sounds good.